Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm shouting just for a second to the people in the back in case you don't already know and you're new to this room. The microphones don't actually have a speaker system. You have to put in your headphones to hear us in the back. I hope that was clear, but I thought I would mention it again. And with that, yeah, let's start off. I know it's already been a long day, but we also have a long number of sessions still ahead. So I hope our session will sort of re-energize you rather than the other way around. But I have a fantastic group of experts here, panel with me. So I'm really looking forward to hearing mostly from them, not from myself, of course. But I want to start us off. We're in the OSCE here. Many of you have been here before, some of you are new, but because we're in the OSCE, and as sort of host of this conference, the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, I thought I'd start off by mentioning that this year marks the 25th anniversary of the mandate of the OSCE RFOM. So the RFOM is 25 years old now. And we've taken this year also a moment to kind of reflect and see what has changed, not only in terms of our work, but also in terms of the media landscape and the ecosystem, the media ecosystem that we look at. And so much has changed over these years, and the challenges that we see to media freedom and linked to that, the challenges to democracy, to security, they haven't changed, they've compounded. They've compounded significantly. They're growing, and it's a little bit of an overwhelming situation I think we find ourselves in. I mean, for instance, 25 years ago when the mandate was adopted, I think if anyone had said that social media would be as pervasive in the lives of billions of people the way it is now, or that technology would play such a prevalent role in shaping societies, probably it'd be difficult to digest that or even believe it, right? So just to point out the changes that we have seen in the years, and over the last few sessions, and also far beyond this conference, we've heavily discussed these challenges that these changes have brought about, that technology has brought about, the challenges around, particularly in these last few sessions, around online content governance practices, and what mechanisms are needed to safeguard our human rights, like freedom of expression online, of course, being one of the main themes throughout the discussions, along with other human rights, of course. But I'd like to use this session to build on all of that and do something a little bit different, focusing back to the core of the mandate, surprising all of the panelists, they're a bit worried already. No, but focusing on the core of the mandate of the office that I work for, I want to start us off by posing a question. What do we want our media ecosystem to look like? How do we want to shape our information space, our social interactions, and what do we need to ensure that, and to ensure an active citizenry that can be established based on, a healthy media ecosystem? And now we find ourselves increasingly in a platform or even social media driven news ecosystem, if I can put it that way. And I think it's safe to already say that this has proven dangerous. Dangerous because it's eroding the important role of the media as an institution of democracy, but also in the context of OSCE, an important pillar of comprehensive security. So in times like these, it's not only expedient, but I think necessary to discuss and strategize around this big question: what do we really want our media ecosystem to look like? And what purpose should it serve? So let's try to think about these fundamental elements of platform governance, also based on perhaps a revitalized concept of the public interest. And we need to do this also, and important to highlight here, continuing to safeguard individual rights, of course. So it's about protecting our human rights, including the right to freedom of expression. So it's not to say that this idea that I'm suggesting with a public interest framework kind of replaces any of our rights, but rather that we perhaps can start thinking about a public interest framework that could add an additional layer not an alternative, but an additional layer to safeguarding our human rights, but also rethinking a healthier, more vibrant, more pluralistic information and media space. So as I mentioned, I'm pleased to have a fantastic panel of experts here to explore the current practices of how information spaces are being shaped today and how we could reimagine it. And I'll introduce you all once I give you the floor, if you agree. So I'll start off to the far left with Kasia, Katarzyna Smiliewicz, co-founder and head of Panoptykon. Before we discuss any grand ideas, it's important, I think, to understand what we're trying to fix, right? So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how currently platforms are using technologies like AI to support the prioritization and dissemination of content to audiences, and how are these practices affecting media freedom and public interest?
Thank you for having me here and for a very kind introduction. I'm intimidated with the scale and the size of the question. Certainly, we can't possibly explain that in a panel, but my premise for this meeting is that we wouldn't be here if certain concepts around the large platforms business model haven't become a commonplace in the debate already. So my role here is to reinstate them more than prove them or go deeper in evidence that is abundant. We really have a lot of evidence proving that large platforms business model does lead to social harms and is not an enabler of pluralism or quality public debate. This is the premise from which European Commission started to propose a new legal framework for large platforms in particular, the process that already resulted into very interesting, very ambitious regulations, Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. So having that context, having also the context of very important Council of Europe work and the work being done by OEC experts as well, I just hope I don't have to retell in this expert group the obvious, but let me summarize what are the stakes in this huge battle we are all waging against the large tech's business model. By saying business model, I mean that not the companies themselves, I think, are the target of the battle, but the business logic that leads to what we call social harms. I'm saying this because I do not think it is a solution to dismantle these platforms or make them illegal, because society clearly needs infrastructure to communicate. And the more we go deeper in authoritarian regimes, in countries where public interest media do not really exist or people have difficulty communicating beyond these platforms, the more we have to appreciate their very existence. So whatever I'm going to say is not really against the very idea of having large social media platforms, but specifically against business model that has been pushed by companies that serve seemingly free service, seemingly free content, free of charge content, and offer people service that which price is not clearly visible immediately to users. And this model is something we need to question and reform. Why? Well, specifically because this is not a service for people who are called users. People called users are exploited in this model. Their attention is exploited, their privacy, their dignity, their right to access information. All this is exploited because of interest of the commercial actors who sponsor their experience. The engagement-based logic that has been, so to say, elephant in the room for all these discussions today and has been mentioned already in the previous panel, this logic is there for a reason. The more time we spend online, the more we click on sponsored content, the more money is made by those who pay for our experience. And the cost of it on the human or society side are pretty visible. We've been, as network of independent organizations, investigative journalists, researchers, we've been collecting evidence of all these harms for a long time. There is even something called the Ledger of Harms, created by Tristan Harris and his organization, full of pretty recent research proving a whole variety of harms with statistical data behind it. But when we look at it, obviously, the first question everybody has is there a causal link between engagement-based ranking and between the design of these services and all these harms that include, mental harms, public debate being full of disinformation and polarized content, very poor pluralism of views within the rabbit holes in which people fall, and in all these phenomena that we've been discussing for years, at least more than 5 years already. The causal link is a tricky thing to prove without access to real data that is only accessible to insiders and data scientists who work inside of these platforms. We all hope that with the new regulatory framework imposed on them by the EU, we will get this access, because access to data for researchers will become one of the obligations, and the European Commission itself will engage in auditing and will demand or propose mitigation measures. So we are probably getting to a point where all these claims will be either verified or rejected. But today we have to speculate, we have to rely on anecdotal evidence and correlations that can be seen from the outside. But being very honest, we can't really prove the causality. But back to evidence, I can just drop some examples that are probably very known to you, but just for making the discussion more entertaining. We all remember Frances Hogan's testimony when she came out last year. She is an algorithm specialist that worked previously before working for Meta. She also worked in Google, Pinterest, and Yelp, so clearly knows the business model from the inside. And she said in the US hearings, I'm here today because I believe Facebook, it was still Facebook back then, products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. And specifically, she said that the algorithm that rewarded posts that generated what Facebook back then called meaningful social interactions, that was this promise for users that finally they get what they wanted, actually is dangerous, because that very model yields unhealthy side effects on imported slices of public content, such as politics and news. So in other words, if as long as social media services rely on what triggers people's attention and what makes them emotionally engaged, it is very unlikely to give more visibility to neutral, fact-checked, public interest news. No, it won't be the case. What will be the case will be visibility of content that is supported by people similar to myself, and is very likely to be emotionally engaging, polarizing, and bringing me more and more into my own rabbit hole. Another case that was very loud last year was Molly Russell's suicide. And in this investigation, the senior coroner, Andrew Walker, said something surprising, I think, even for us, for the civil society so critical towards large platforms, because he claimed that algorithms that curate social media user experience pushed harmful content to Molly, and that she had not requested, and she was actually subjected to content that was not supposed to be offered to a person of her age, and therefore it ruled out that she died from an act of self-harm while suffering from depression and the negative effects of online content. So I think it's the first case where we have that allegation that the impact can be so detrimental that even a suicidal act is reframed as, something else. I guess we are talking about a new phenomena for the criminal law as well. And finally, I can bring some examples from TikTok, because that platform has attracted a lot of media attention recently because of the dynamic, because of the significant growth of its user base in Europe. and US. And here we have one very interesting investigation performed by Wall Street Journal that demonstrates the mechanism we all know and discuss, but here we have proof of this mechanism. TikTok relies on how much time users spend watching each video in order to steer them toward more videos of the same sort. And it's apparently sufficient to spend more time on one specific type of content, emotionally engaging type of content, to immediately receive more recommendations of the same sort, which leads especially young users into very dangerous rabbit holes with the content that is no longer moderated the same way as very popular content on TikTok, because simply moderators cannot do their job in this very dark corners of the platform in a very efficient way. Ben Smith, reporter of the New York Times, even claimed that TikTok's algorithm is incredibly good in revealing people's desires, including the desires they've been repressing themselves, like their real sexual orientation, for example. So, discovering all that shows the challenge that especially young users, young people being subjected to this algorithmic curation face, and the question of mental harm, digital well-being, exposure to specific radicalizing, polarizing, or sensational content. All these challenges are pretty clear at that point. The big question is, how can we face them without questioning the very core of the business model, which is making money on content that is free, that is served without charging people who watch it? How else can we approach that challenge? We do have some ideas within our network, and I believe we have space to discuss these ideas later on. And now I should, I guess, end my intro.
Thank you, Kasia, for an excellent intro and a really helpful overview of what we're talking about in terms of the challenges that we are indeed trying to address, and also for the examples, particularly mentioning also, I think a nice segue is the Hogan testimony and the link or the clear message that was given of the impact that these practices have, particularly on information flows with regards to politics and news online, and how this causes divisions and weakens democracy. And since we're talking about news and media, I want to move to Hans Hoffmann, who is the head of Media Fundamentals and Production at the European Broadcasting Union, the EBU, focusing a little bit in your role also on public service media. So I'd like to ask you if you could tell us a little bit specifically about the difficulties that you find that public service media face in this attention economy, and the possible ways forward to safeguard this notion of public interest content, as we just discussed at the beginning, and what role can or maybe should public service media play in that regard?
But I come back and say a very important role. But before that, also thank you for having me here. For those who don't know the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, it's much more than the Eurovision Song Contest, I think, which you all know. So the EBU is actually the professional non-for-profit association of public service media organizations in Europe, with many associates actually around the globe, such as Canada, such as the US, even Australia, NHK in Japan. So we have a pretty widespread of membership, 113, 111 members. Let's just recap when we come to your question. What is actually the core mission of a public service media organization? So in the old times, it was always defined as providing universal values, provide reliable, good quality content in the public interest to the audience, to the citizens. And when you translate this now into the future, we associate adjectives such as trustworthy news, such as, is the content origin? Has it been altered? Has it been altered by algorithms? I mean, it's a completely new era for public service media organizations who were used to have a very reliable, well thought and workflow in terms of news distribution to the audiences. Now, online has changed everything and social media has changed everything. And this is, of course, as you rightly say, the challenge for us. And this brings me to one of the points what we are actually arguing, fighting since several years already, which is the ranking and the prominence on platforms and in social media environments. This is an issue. And just to give you one example to visualize this a little bit, if you go to a very famous search engine and you type in, for example, Doctor Who, which is a very prominent series of the BBC, you will definitely not be led to the BBC homepage. We will be led perhaps to an alternative provider. Could be YouTube, for example, which is not the origin of the content. So here is a good visualization. When we talk about, for example, sound and audio and the prominence of voice, when you speak into one of the very famous, I do always hard at the moment not to name the names of the manufacturers, but if you use a voice assistant and ask the voice assistant for a podcast, probably you will be led to a commercial provider and not necessarily to, for example, Swedish Radio, which is a public service broadcaster. So this visualizes the problem of prominence, of findability for public service media organizations. This has then to do, of course, with data. How is data used? How is data fed into the algorithms, which then, of course, feed the search and the answers, what the public would get when they do and perform the search. Trust is another important topic for public service media organizations. In particular, since all of us, I mean the public service media, they live from trusted news and a trusted relationship between the broadcaster or media company, as we rather call ourselves now, and the audience and the citizens. And this trust, of course, with fake news, with deep fakes, with altered content can be easily damaged. So it's an arms race almost, that you use tools, that you use and educate your journalists in a way that you detect when information is false, correct it, and quickly push it out in a correct way. But it's truly an arms race between the machines which generate fake news and the machines which help you to detect the fake news and then to correct this. Another challenge for us, certainly in this context, is the skills, is the availability of sufficient data science personnel in the broadcast organization. What is our approach as EBU to that? We have, of course, the approach that we collaborate. Otherwise, there would be no reason to have an association. An association actually lives from collaboration. And in this particular context, in our department, Technology and Innovation, we have started already a couple of years ago to develop systems and algorithms which we provide to the public service media organizations. One of them is, for example, called Peach, which is a recommendation engine. And already the start of the development of the recommendation engine, we tried here very hard to follow inclusive roles so that the algorithms, that the product itself is not biased. And we make this available to all of the EBU members as a potential very transparent system, and transparency here is very important in how recommendations are built. Another example is a tool what we have developed, which helps you to translate automatically either text or language between the different, and we still have language barriers in the world, as we all know, in particular for news, between the different sources. And this helps journalists a lot. This has led to a tool, what we call the European Perspective, which is another one of our products which was developed, which we give in the hands of journalists in the newsroom to quickly understand in the native language of the journalist what is happening around the world in terms of news generation. And this, of course, supports quickly to identify and detect false information if they are spread via any of the media. So the challenges are big, and I think, and one of the most critical ones, I think, what we have is that media companies more and more become technology companies. Not everybody likes this, but it is an evidence that technology is actually used in every domain. And the question, of course, for me will be then, how can we translate the policies, what we define, and the regulations, what we define, and we need them desperately. How can we translate them into standards, which at the end of the day need to be followed? A standard should not be too rigid. It needs to be open enough so that the ecosystem, that the industry can develop products which are used in order to fulfill our merits, our values for content generation and distribution. But I think this is an overall task which we address through our involvement in international and global standards bodies. But I think there's a lot of work to be done here. I stop here for a moment.
Thank you so much, Hans. Very, very interesting, and also nice to see the challenges, but also what EBU is doing to respond to some of this, and attempting to positively use the technologies that we are here also sort of unpacking and criticizing and figuring out. So it's very, very interesting thoughts. Thank you so much. One thing that what you said, media companies have more and more become tech companies. It's a sad reality, but also, well, not a sad reality. It's an interesting anecdote, because I always think tech companies have more and more become media companies in a way as well. So it's sort of this.
Well, I think it's
strange.
Yeah, use tech to generate media. Use tech to generate media.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting. But you ended with this questions around how to develop standards, and which also nicely brings me to our next speaker, Eleonora Mazzoli, who's a PhD researcher at the London School of Economics, who's going to give us the quick fix answers and solutions to the grand questions I had at the beginning of our session. No, but it would be really interesting to hear from you, because I know you've done a lot of research in this area. If you could talk us through a little bit the practicalities. We're here talking about a public interest framework. We've kind of understood now a little bit what we're talking about, but what can it look like? What would a public interest framework look like? How would you define it? Who should define it? And obviously, there will be some risks. What are those risks potentially that it carries? Yeah, and maybe just to explore this angle a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. Of course, I'm not going, spoiler alert, provide the solution to everything. I might raise more questions than bring answers, but I'd like to sort of reflect on the research that I've been doing, on some of the discussion that we had previously in a workshop with some of the experts in the room, to suggest or point out some possible solution that are there, and some of the key questions that I think, especially as states and regulators are thinking about this area, they should be asking themselves when approaching regulation. And I would start by saying that posing questions about the public interest in new forms of intermediation is nothing new, right? It's always been part of media and communication discussion. It's sort of embedded and infused in the profession of media and communication as an obligation towards the public. Then we might argue, what is this public? How you define it, but also the key question here is also how you then transcribe it into obligations or benefits that reflect this sort of non-economic ideology or non-markets ideology that policy, especially media and communication policy, have always tried to take into account to then contribute to broader societal benefits and create some form of public value. But I also want to question a bit this notion in a way. We're dealing with a very normative notion, very contested, often ill-defined. It can be vague, it can be malleable. You hear this notion used in calls for intervention, but also in calls for the regulation at the same time. So I think when we speak about the public interest or public interest framework, it needs to be contextualized and also operationalized in a way, depending on what kinds of problem we're looking at and what kinds of actors also that we're looking at. And in particular today, I think we're looking at this question of whether law and policy should intervene to create a framework that is applicable, especially for content curation, which is sort of the other side of content moderation. And the ideal goal would be to sort of prompt a positive change in industry dynamics and shape, let's say, in a positive way, access to news and media online in a way that is not just driven by commercial private interest, as Kasia was mentioning in the beginning, but that there are some public interest objectives. And again, here, whose interest we are addressing here? What is the envisioned public behind it? What kinds of objective are we addressing? Is it diversity and plurality online? Is it freedom of expression, privacy, freedom of choice, all of them together? How do you balance it when you shape and develop a policy intervention? Because intervening to protect one objective might also have counter or unintended consequences towards another. And I would say that we can start by sort of a very high level, but very useful way that research I've been looking at it as the public interest and institutional imperative and a regulatory mandate. An institutional imperative could be decline into core objectives that organization in general, like media or news, but also platforms and online intermediary, should aim to achieve in their daily practices in a more sort of independent and self-regulatory way. And as a regulatory mandate, we could think of it as areas that we know where the market is not really functioning already, and therefore an intervention is needed to fix it in a way or ideally positively shape it. And to make it a bit more concrete, I'd like to bring 3 examples in a way. One self-regulatory, a sort of co-regulatory more saturated, then one taken from a recent study to which I contributed on media plurality online, where we developed a policy toolkit for prominence and content prioritization online. So a concrete example of where a combination of co-regulation and sort of statutory intervention is exactly public service media, right? You have a mission to serve the public interest, but this is not just a high-level mission. It's translated into objectives, into legal obligation, into a remit that sort of impose certain obligation on what kinds of content you provide, what approaches you might have to data as well, what kinds of standards of transparency, diversity, accountability, independence they have to strive for. And this is then translated into AI system that this organization use themselves. An example is, for instance, the BBC Public Interest Framework for AI and Machine Learning. And there, again, they have a very high level set of principles, but then they are transposed and translated and operationalized depending on what kinds of AI or data-driven technologies we're addressing. So they've collaborated with the Data Lovelace Institute to try and develop an ethics by design framework to data practices that looks at personal autonomy, explainability, transparency, and how to address this question when they deal with users' data, because they also deal with, as Hans was saying, with analyzing and collecting data. But also they've then translated this into this notion of diversified algorithm that doesn't only optimize for engagement, popularity, or relevance, but also takes into account this diversity of exposure, which is part of the Peach project as well. And then a more self-regulatory example comes from news media organization. Again, here we've always seen sort of self-designed, self-imposed behavioral codes that think about this very high-level public interest notion, but then how do you translate it? And there are some examples out there they've tried to translate this notion into standards. And one example is the Journalist Trust Initiatives. For those who are not familiar, this is a multi-stakeholder initiative that developed technical standards at European level to define quote unquote, trustworthy journalism. And that's a very contested, we can open up the discussion on that, but they've tried to sort of put forward a list of standards on transparency of ownership, of content policy, of data practices, independence, and so on, like diversity. And they've put forward this way of sort of trying and give almost a certification to those media outlets that apply for it, that can then be translated into a machine readable code that platforms and advertisers could pick up to surface, recommend, rank higher these kinds of outlets that have respected, in a way, these high professional standards. There are a lot of questions here as well on like scalability, inclusivity, looking at like what kinds of organizations that have already these standards, which organization don't have access to the standards, how do you comply with it? We can go into detail of that, but it's one way of looking at this and how to operationalize it and link it back to this online distribution ecosystem. And then a last example that we can open up and continue is thinking about this question of prominence, which when we look at content curation is very much embedded, right? We're looking at positive intervention, how platforms prioritize content, what kind of policy feed into that. And in the study that we did, funded by the Commission, we sort of mapped industry and policy initiatives around this, and we try and come up with a policy toolkit, which again, I don't think it's really a sort of solution, but it's a set of tools, a set of questions, and a set of steps that ideally member states, and the target for the study was a European member state, but I think it could be useful to reflect on how these can be used in other contexts beyond that. And to do that, we sort of said, okay, what are the key questions that we want to highlight and the key steps? And these are the why, the what, the where, the who, and the how. Very simplistic in a way. But the why is make states reflecting on the rationale for interventions, right? So what are the underlying market dynamics that you're trying to change when you want to regulate content curation and prioritization practices? What are the positive and negative principles that should be guiding this reform? The what is the material scope. So what are the services that you think should benefit from mandated prominence, and what are the criteria that should be used to define these services? How does these services link back to the rationales? Because if you prioritize and if you sort of introduce a regulatory mandate to prioritize a state affiliated, in practice, broadcasters or media organization, then the objective of ensuring diversity and plurality is actually not achieved. You might sort of insert soft form of propaganda and censorship through regulation. And this is actually what's happening in China with some of the proposals that come up in this area. So thinking about what kinds of criteria do you develop to define these public interest services rather than content, I would highlight here, there's a lot of sort of risk to think about just content and rather than sort of focusing on the services. So creating criteria that look at the processes of distribution, of management and ownership that could ideally then foster positive practices in media. The where, the scope of application, are we looking in on intermediaries? Which kind of intermediaries? Should we have different approaches depending on what kind of platforms or intermediaries we're looking at? Should it be like a layered or tier system? And what does appropriate prominence look like? So thinking at the where and how to apply it. The who, which regulatory body should be most suitable to do this. And the how, which is again, sort of what kinds of regulatory tools, because depending on the problem, you might have different solution in terms of self-co and statutory intervention, but also the accountability and assessment processes that needs to be put in place since the beginning to make sure that there's no undue state interferences in these processes, because that's sort of state capture in this situation, and depending on, especially if we're dealing with sort of weaker democracy or authoritarian states, it's very much a real threat. And I'll leave it like that. This is sort of very, again, high level principle. We can go in details with more examples later.
High-level principles, but very detailed and fascinating. So I'm still digesting myself. So I'm not even going to respond to any of the, fascinating stuff. And I urge you all, if you have time, to also read the study that Eleonora has brought out, because this is a really like a snippet of the details, and it's very, very interesting. Also, you're all making my life as a moderator very easy, I have to admit, because there's such a perfect flow of where you end and where the next person continues. We're just talking about the question of prominence and how platforms prioritize content. And moving swiftly then to our last but certainly not least panelist, Max Galler, who is here from the Oversight Board. And I apologize, it says Facebook Oversight Board, it's the Oversight Board. And the OB has recently published a policy advisory on Meta's cross-check system, which is very much exactly about this, sort of how to prioritize what kind of content. And it would be really interesting to hear from you the sort of assessment that OB has had on that, and maybe some key recommendations that you can share with us on that you have had for Meta on how to promote public interest content in a meaningful way and a non-harmful way. As we have heard, there are many challenges around that. So please.
Well, thank you very much for having me. So given that it's a relatively specific question about a piece of work that the board published earlier this month, I thought I'd just briefly go over what the board is, what it does. So it's an independent body of diverse experts that Meta had set up to essentially make difficult content decisions, set precedents for how to handle similar problems, and to make recommendations on how Meta can improve its policies, its practices, and better fulfill its human rights obligations. Our board members include academics, human rights activists, journalists, judges, and a former head of state. And I work as part of the administration. So we help the board members select, investigate, and deliberate on cases and help them draft their decisions. We've got a very diverse workforce so far. And while we are quite well funded, we're also really small. We've got approximately 80 staff, which means there's a little over 1,000 people working at Meta for every one person working at the oversight board. And in addition to holding Meta accountable and helping them improve what they do, one of the board's main aims is to make the company's content moderation decisions, its policies, and its practices more transparent and open to external critique and review. So just sort of a note on the sort of scale, about 3 billion people or unique people use Meta's platforms every month, and the company makes approximately 100 million content moderation decisions every day. So if they've got a 99% overall accuracy rate, say, that's still 1 million wrong decisions every single day. The board's only dealing with a tiny fraction of that, and the cross-check program is only dealing with a tiny fraction of that. The board's had about 2 million cases, I think, appealed to us so far. And from that, we've issued 32 case decisions with a few more underway. And we've published 2 policy advisory opinions with another one in the works. Those are the sort of the board's 2 main outputs. Cases are individual content moderation decisions that the board has chosen to investigate and publish a decision on. And the subjects we've looked into have been really varied so far. And we've tried to go for sort of a globally diverse range of cases as well. So we've had a recent decision where the board examined Meta's relationship with British police and Meta's apparent willingness to remove lawful content without proper procedures in place. And earlier, in another example, we had the Arabic words case where we assessed the difficulty of enforcing rules against hate speech while also allowing for minority and marginalized communities to reclaim slurs that have historically been used against them. The board's decisions about what to do with the single piece of content in question are binding on Meta, but the recommendations the board makes about the company's policies and practices are not, though Meta does have to publicly respond to the board, setting out sort of whether and how they'll implement the recommendations and their reasoning behind their decisions. So far, we've issued, I think, a little over 120 recommendations, and Meta has agreed to implement or partially implement approximately 70% of them so far. The other main work stream of the board is policy advisory opinions, which was the cross-check decision. These can be a lot broader than individual cases, and they don't focus on a single piece of content. They involve Meta sending the board a request to give an opinion on an area where the company's policy and procedure basically needs help and raises some difficult questions that the company isn't sure it can handle by itself or should handle by itself. Our first PO was on how to handle the sharing of private residential information. The cross-check one was the second, and the one that is being worked on at the moment is on COVID misinformation. So, and one of the benefits of policy advisory opinion is that the board has a lot more scope and time to meet with external stakeholders, conduct more wide-ranging research, and issue much more in-depth decisions. The cross-check PO itself, well, that was started last year after the board called Meta out quite publicly for not being fully forthcoming on the topic with the board prior to that. And we started working on it shortly after the Washington Post exposés. It did take quite a lot of time for us to publish a decision, a little over a year, but it is an incredibly complicated system, and it really required careful analysis, especially to try and come up with ways that it could be repaired and improved. So Meta's own description of cross-check is that it's a program that provides additional levels of review for certain content that its internal systems flag as violating, with the goal of preventing or minimizing the highest risk false positive moderation errors. Or in other words, it's a system to try and make sure that they don't accidentally take down high-profile posts and cause themselves public relations or commercial problems. It's largely used for celebrities, government leaders, influential figures. It's people who have come onto the platforms with a large following or people who have built one there. There are multiple strands to the cross-check program. The most relevant to this discussion is what Meta calls its early response secondary review. That's essentially a list that Meta has created of users whose posts get the benefit of extra levels of review, even when they're found to be violating Meta's policies on the platforms. So a piece of content from one of these users will stay on the platform, even if its normal review processes initially flag it as violating a policy, and it will stay there until it has gone through further layers of review. And that can be up to 5 levels of review in some cases. So one of the examples that we called out in the PAO was content from an international football star, posted non-consensual pornography of a woman accusing him of rape. That stayed on the platform for over a day after it was initially identified, and it was viewed by over 50 million people in that time. So that's a small demonstration of the sort of level of harm this program can do. And the additional rounds of review that content goes through when it's posted by a cross-check user escalates in seniority, kind of depending and in a level that sort of correlates to the impact that the decision could have on the company. So I suppose cross-check isn't an amplification tool per se, but when clearly violating viral content is intentionally allowed to spread across the platforms, then the company that gave these people so much reach is essentially amplifying that content that's clearly not in the public interest. And sort of key to this discussion, you could almost say that Meta's suppressing some types of public interest content by failing to apply this level of protection to users that the company knows could often be caught by their normal moderation practices. So that would include examples like journalists and civil society discussing atrocities, and you sort of posting images or using words that might be sort of flagged and picked up on. But it could go all the way through to things like breast cancer awareness posts, where a picture showing early signs of breast cancer could be sort of automatically flagged as pornography and then not reviewed by a human. The cross-check system should be ensuring that this sort of public interest content is not taken down without additional review, rather than prioritizing business interests. So sort of to summarize the board's main conclusion, it's that the program is neither designed nor implemented in a manner that meets Meta's stated human rights commitments or its company's values. It also found that the system prioritizes those commercial interests over human rights protection where those two factors come into conflict. So to respond to that problem, the board has been pushing for a clear and effective internal divide within Meta between the company's sort of speech oversight on one hand and its political and commercial interests on the other. They shouldn't be talking to each other. They should be doing separate jobs without sort of one answering to the other. The board also identified kind of 4 key problem areas in this to be addressed in this program. First is the unequal treatment of users. So there's very clear and relatively easy to access criteria for business partners and government leaders to get onto the cross-check program. But that doesn't exist for journalists and civil society organizations and other users whose content is likely to be important from a human rights perspective. The second main issue is the delayed removal of violating content. So on average, Meta takes over 5 days to reach a decision on content from users on its cross-check lists, and some content can wait for months before it's sort of finally signed off and a final decision is made. And this whole time it stays on the platform. Meta also fails to track kind of core metrics around this program. And that's one of the issues that made it such a hard system to investigate, is that Meta does not have sufficient internal measures to assess the effectiveness of its own program. So it's really hard to tell whether the system is actually producing more accurate enforcement decisions or just more commercially favorable ones. And the final sort of problem area is just the lack of transparency about how the system works. Meta's provided very little information to the public and to its users about this system. Users aren't told that they're on a cross-check list. They're not told what the procedures are for creating and auditing these lists, and that information has not been made public. So in order to address this, and I think I'm coming around to the actual meat of your question right at the end, the board has made about 32 specific recommendations in this policy advisory opinion, but they fall into sort of 3 main groups. That Meta should prioritize users and expressions that are important for human rights and are of public interest without overly protecting content that risks the opposite. So, posts from these users should be reviewed in a separate workflow, and repeatedly violating commercial users should be stripped of special protection. Second is that Meta should radically increase the transparency around cross-check and how it operates. So this includes measuring, auditing, and publishing key metrics, setting out clear public criteria for inclusion on cross-check lists, and publicly marking the accounts of certain categories of entities receiving this list-based protection, including state actors, political candidates, and business partners of Meta. And finally, Meta should reduce the harm caused by content left up during enhanced review. So content identified as violating during Meta's first or sort of standard assessment that is high severity should be removed or hidden while further review is taking place. And Meta needs to invest in resources necessary to match its review capacity and to reduce the massive backlog. We should get a response from Meta to all of these recommendations sometime early next year. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much they commit to changing.
Thank you very much, Max, for this overview. And I'm very conscious of time, and I think we all deserve maybe 2 or 3 coffees at this point. So I would suggest that we can sort of organically continue with the Q&A outside while having a coffee rather than in here. And I think you'll all probably agree with me if I propose this. But what I would like to do is come back to our panelists just once, and not with any long additional presentations, but really, I mean, if you can in a word, but obviously in a sentence is even ambitious, but maybe in a sentence, what is like the main key message you would like us to leave this room with on this particular topic while we go and have a coffee? No pressure. I should probably, maybe we start backwards. And Max,
Sure.
if you, yeah.
Yeah, I think the main issue here is working out how these systems can be made to sort of better promote public interest content without amplifying harmful content, or letting important expressions sort of fall through the cracks is incredibly difficult. It took the board a lot of money and over a year to get its head around cross-check and publish some recommendations. So to tackle these problems, it really needs to be done on a kind of really detailed sort of step-by-step basis, rather than trying to sort of step in and make sweeping changes based on kind of ideals and philosophy, because that's not really going very well at Twitter as far as we can tell.
Thanks, Max. Eleonora?
Yeah, maybe like one last final thought building on the intervention. I would draw the attention on this contested definition of public interest services or content, because as we saw, every company has got its own definition. Every news media organization might have its own opinion about it. They might all want to be public interest content, but then we're talking about ranking, prioritization. There has to be some way of collaborating, talking to each other. There are civil society organizations that also have a list of standards and indicators. So one word of like hope is try and talk to each other, bring everyone together in a room before you intervene in the wrong way, let's say.
Thank you. And Hans?
From the PSM, public service media point of view, I think we are facing global acting industries, and in order to scale in our way with them, I think the only word is collaboration.
So we've heard collaboration.
Collaboration
Yes,
amongst the
excellent.
public service media institutes with partners, build the skills on the engineering side as well as on the editorial side.
Very good. Thank you. And Kasia, final words.
Well, I feel I need to be short after everybody being so short. Well, the network in which Panopticon functions has been so far quite vocal and consistent about the need to work together and come up with clear demands for the large platforms, not only on due process and the way they should assess risks, but also clear demands with regard to how they should redesign their services. More specifically for this discussion, redesign, reprogram algorithms responsible for how they curate content available to people. And this is by no means an easy exercise, but we think like that the next year, 2023, with the DSA, DMA being fully operational and the European Commission starting real oversight of these platforms does give us a chance to voice not only concerns, which we've been doing for a while, but also this clear demand. So if anybody here as organization or individual would like to be engaged in this conceptual process, please get in touch with me. We will be definitely working on that. And I do hope that there will be partners from OEC and beyond helping us. Thank you.
There will. There will. And as a native German speaker, I want to say these were a little bit like our long German sentences that were like a paragraph each, but very important points. That's why thank you so much for these final remarks that we can take with us and continue thinking about and discussing at our coffee break. Thank you all for joining this session, and we continue in 10 minutes. So drink your coffee real fast, guys. We continue in 10 minutes, I think, across the hall again. And yes, thank you to our wonderful panelists again.